This is the time of year when we start seeing sellers sell in the NFL and buyers buying, but the Commanders could be in the market to do a little bit of both. All of that right now on Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome inside to today's episode of Locked On Commanders. I am your host, David Harrison, here with you Monday through Friday, your friend, your eyes, your ears on the ground, covering the Washington Commanders, doing so for WUSA9.com, your local DMV CBS affiliate, and also doing it for Sports Illustrated's CommanderGameDay.com. I want to thank you for coming through for today's episode, in which we're going to talk about the Commanders buying, but also maybe selling just a little bit here in what many refer to as the final quote-unquote phase of building an NFL roster, although the roster building process is never really finished. So every day, there's those of you who come through every single day, a special thank you to you for coming through every single day. If you're not already, please subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you're listening to today's episode. And if you're new to the program, welcome to Locked On Commanders. This is a daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I hope you like what you hear, and I hope you come back and join us again very, very soon. So we talk about the waves of roster moves that happen in the National Football League. We're entering now what many consider to be the final wave of roster building moves that NFL teams make as they get ready for their OTA periods, as they get ready for training camp. And ideally, if you're an NFL team, you'd like to have your roster about as set as you possibly can entering into training camp. Training camp is really the time to go into it, develop your players, kind of have a strategy of how you're going to attack their development, your team's construction as a whole, and figure out the camp battles and all that stuff. You don't typically want to come into training camp and still be adding pieces and doing all that. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that general managers are always looking to add pieces, right? We're talking about the main part of the roster construction for a given year. So it's a little bit of a little bit of water in both baskets, right? So the waves of the offseason that we've already seen, you've got the early offseason, free agency wave 1, free agency wave 2, the NFL draft, free agency wave 3, and now what I like to refer to as the tinkering phase. You're just tinkering with your roster. And if you play fantasy football in season long or dynasty modes, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about tinkering, right? So early offseason, that's when teams evaluate who they want to keep, who they're willing to lose. They make key re-signings before the new league year begins to not let those key players hit the open market, hit free agency. They also sometimes remove key players, right? This is the phase of the offseason where we saw the Commanders release defensive tackle Jonathan Allen, for example, this year. That all leads into free agency wave 1, which starts at the opening of the open negotiating period for the NFL. That's when you continue to consider your in-house free agents, but you're also targeting your primary external options. For the Commanders this year, re-signing quarterback Marcus Mariota, tight end Zach Ertz, linebacker Bobby Wagner. They traded for receiver Deebo Samuel, offensive tackle Laramie Tunsil, so not free agent moves, but all within that window. Also went out and signed defensive lineman Javon Kinlaw, safety Will Harris, outside linebacker Jacob Martin, among other moves that they made in this period. Following that, you kind of have that major rush, that free agency frenzy, I think as NFL Network likes to put it. Then you kind of have a little bit of a settling period. Then you get into free agency wave 2, where you're kind of finalizing your in-house considerations, right? We saw defensive end Cleveland Ferrell brought back in this phase, things like that. But you're also looking at external options, right? Wide receiver Michael Gallup came out of retirement, joined the Commanders during this phase. Guard Nate Herbig agreed to sign with the Commanders during this phase, all leading into the NFL draft, which of course is when you're going to execute your rookie strategy. And then free agency wave 3. Typically, you're going to find cheaper veterans who can provide niche support. Every once in a while, you get a big name veteran who kind of held out and said, I'm going to wait to see what teams do in the draft and everything else, and then go make my move. But typically, this is where you find your cheaper veterans. This is where you also sign your UDFAs. The Commanders added guys like safety Rob McDaniel, cornerback Carlin Viggers, tackle Tyree Phillips, who came in for a rookie minicamp invite, ended up coming out with a contract. And now we're in the tinkering phase. This is where you kind of make those fine details, those fine shifts. Certainly players like Trey Hendrickson are going to be talked about as his situation continues to loom with the Cincinnati Bengals. But we get into the buyers and sellers markets. That's where this conversation is going to take us into, and whether or not the Commanders should be looking to buy or whether they should be looking to sell. And for some teams, it's very obvious on what they should be doing, right? For the Washington Commanders, you look at a team that is 1 year removed from being on the cusp of going to the Super Bowl. So clearly a team that has championship aspirations. All 32 teams have championship aspirations. But if you're sitting back and you're being real about the state of your team and your roster, which for the Washington Commanders, you have a lot of confidence. And we saw Adam Peters, general manager, kind of go a little bit more all in this year. This is a general manager who preached building through the NFL draft, yet spent a good amount of his draft capital bringing in veterans like Deebo Samuel and Laramie Tunsil that he believes are going to help this team win more this year, even if it's not necessarily more regular season games, like 13 regular season wins versus 12 last year. You might come away with 10 or 11, but you'll be better set up, in theory anyway, to make even more noise and perhaps topple the Philadelphia Eagles on your way to your own Super Bowl berth in 2025, 2026, right? However, I look at the Commanders in two different phases, right? Because I think the Washington Commanders, while yes, they should be buyers and they should be interested in key players, impact players that other teams might be selling and might be looking to move, they've also got some players themselves that they might be still willing to trade off, might be willing to sell in the instance of this conversation. And the main one that comes to mind to me is someone that we talked about before this offseason. He's basically taken the place of Jonathan Allen, right? We go back to before Jonathan Allen was released, probably about 2 years back, right? In his history, constantly being a trade target rumor or a player that we talk about potentially being traded. And then in the shadows, the kind of the caveat to the Jonathan Allen trade conversation was also, by the way, Daron Payne, depending on how he performs, may also be up for trade. Well, Jonathan Allen is out now, so someone else has to take that mantle as being the most talked about trade potential player, and that guy has become defensive tackle Daron Payne, along with running back Brian Robinson Jr., who we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But Daron Payne turns 28 in May. He accounts for $26 million against salary cap this season. The Commanders would save $7.57 million with a post-June 1st release. They would save $20.57 million in a post-June 1st trade, according to Spot Track. Now, Daron Payne played a career-low 742 snaps last season, also a career-low 69% of the defensive snaps last season. So it wasn't just, well, he only played 742 because there weren't a lot of defensive snaps to go around. No, he only played 742 snaps and also a career-low 69% of the defensive snaps, even with Jonathan Allen's injury. Think about the amount of time that John Allen missed, and coming into the season, you would consider Daron Payne that number 2 D tackle. His play, his snaps, his rep share did not go up, even though Jonathan Allen's injury obviously took a very large chunk of snap opportunities away from the defense. And look, this would honestly just be kind of a continuation of the Washington Commanders unintentionally, right, according to the team, kind of casting away Ron Rivera players, right? Daron Payne was Ron Rivera guy, got his extension while Ron Rivera was with the organization, had a really great contract season. After that, we've seen Daron Payne's production dip, and in some lights, you kind of seen his effort dip. It seemed like, again, there was kind of the really troubling quote to me where he kind of talked about how he likes to take the first half to kind of see what the rhythm of the game is going to be, feel out the pace, and then come out in the second half and really try to react to it. And I'm not really sure I like that. And I just don't know if that approach to the game really fits what the Washington Commanders are looking to do. And it's represented, I think, in the career low snaps, in the career low snap percentage that Daron experienced last year in his first year with this Washington Commanders staff. So certainly there could be a market out there for him. Certainly the Washington Commanders could look to take advantage of that market, maybe recoup some draft capital, or perhaps put him in a package that brings in a different type of player, so on and so forth. There's lots of options out there. We will talk about some potential trade proposals later on, not in an essence to say this is the trade that the Commanders should or would or will make, but more so just to, again, kind of give a ballpark of what these trades could look like. But before we get to that, we've got 2 more Commanders players who could be moved. Then we're going to look at some players that the Washington Commanders could be buying as they look to continue building a championship roster. That and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The NBA playoffs are in full swing. Every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. And this episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel. Whether it's in-game winning shots or breakout players, there's never a better time for you to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy for you to stay in the game before tip-off and even live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. My Denver Nuggets could not seal the deal, couldn't make it happen against the Oklahoma City Thunder, who are now minus 185 favorites to win the NBA Finals. Obviously, they are now favored to win the Western Conference Finals championship, I should say, against the Minnesota Timberwolves. And in the Eastern Conference, it is the New York Knicks, who are minus 144 favorites to come out of the East. So if you're new to FanDuel, it is the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Continuing now, today's episode of Locked On Commanders, talking about the Washington Commanders being buyers or sellers here in what is commonly referred to as the final phase of roster building for NFL teams as they get ready to enter the OTAs, mini camps, training camp right around the corner. And to me, the Commanders, again, like I said, should be buyers if the right players are available to be sent out by other teams, but also have some pieces they might be looking to move themselves to help recoup either some draft capital or put into a package that brings in one of those players that other teams might be, quote unquote, selling off, right? The second player that could be moved by the Washington Commanders, this is a player that's been talked about by a lot of people during the offseason, especially with the expectation heading into the NFL draft that the Washington Commanders would target a running back early. And that, of course, is Brian Robinson Jr., who turned 26 in March, cost $3.6 million against salary cap this year. The Commanders would save nearly all of it with any kind of move. They could release him now, trade him now, release him, or trade him after June 1st, and they would basically save the same amount of money. The Commanders running back played a career high 505 snaps, 52% of the offensive snaps in 2024, set career highs in rushing yards with 799, yards per carry with 4.3, and he had 8 rushing touchdowns, a new high on the ground, though he did fall shy of matching his career high 9 touchdowns in a single season, which he set in 2023. Production did fall off in the second half of the season, a career low 44% success rate overall for B-Rob in his third NFL season. So, a lot of hot and cold. And I know there are still people who believe in Brian Robinson Jr. Honestly, I'm one of them. I still think Brian Robinson Jr. has loads of talent. I do think that, it's hard. You can't necessarily make excuses for players in the NFL, right? But I do think there are factors that should be taken into account. And I think the 3 injuries that Brian Robinson suffered to his right leg, some of the injuries that the offensive line suffered, some of the breakdown that we saw, right? The offensive line, similar to the running backs, the offensive line was run blocking a lot better in the first half of the season than they were in the second half of the season. Now, again, injuries take a part in that. Schemes being figured out take a part in that. Fatigue just in general takes a part of that as well. So I think that a lot of those things just kind of combined for us to see that dip in running game production, not just from Brian Robinson, right? But just run game overall outside of Jaden Daniels just kind of dipped. I don't think Brian Robinson is the problem to the run game, I think is the best way that I should put that. And given the fact that the Washington Commanders didn't go out there and draft, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, Omarion Hampton, one of these top running backs in the first, say, 100 picks of the draft, they did go get Ja'Cory Crosskey-Merritt in the 7th round. I, for one, am very, very excited about what his future might be. I know a lot of Commanders fans are also very excited about what his future could be, but I think it would be very, very short-sighted and misguided to move Brian Robinson Jr. before you really get a look at what Ja'Cory Crosskey-Merritt is going to bring to the NFL. Haven't even seen a chance to get him in pads yet. So to make a move like this right now in this phase, right, of the roster building process, I do think would be a little bit misguided, but I know that he's a name that a lot of people will talk about. So I at least wanted to acknowledge that conversation is being had out there. However, like I said, personally, I don't think Brian Robinson is the problem to the run game last year. I just think there was a lot of other contextual matters that came in hand. So I think that Brian Robinson staying with the team this year, continuing to be that lead back, probably the most likely outcome. Now, as it stands right now, I don't think I would predict a contract extension unless B-Rob is willing to take kind of that, okay, this is what it takes to be a Commander. This is how much money you're going to give me. I'm going to do it just because I want to be a part of this process. If that's Brian Robinson's mentality heading into next offseason, then I think a deal might be able to get done. However, if he wants to be paid and if he wants to further the agenda of the running back brotherhood and, hey, we're valuable a commodity and we should be paid as such and pursued as such, then I think probably you're going to end up seeing him end up elsewhere in the 2026 offseason. The final player that I think the Washington Commanders could be looking to potentially move, safety Percy Butler. Percy Butler turns 25 in May, counts for $3.6 million against 2025 salary cap. The Commanders, again, like Brian Robinson Jr., both these players are on rookie contracts, would save just about all of it with any kind of move. Played on just 37% of the defensive snaps for the Commanders defense last year, but he did play in 63% of the special team snaps. So still a contributor across the ball. 0 interceptions, 0 sacks, only 4 tackles for loss, and 1 forced fumble in 3 seasons with the Washington Commanders. I think that with Percy Butler, it's less about Percy, honestly, and it's more about the additions of Will Harris, Kane Medrano, the health and readiness of Tyler Owens, Dominique Hampton's development. Undrafted free agent Rob McDaniel has a lot of expectation around him. I think all of these guys, and then you still have, obviously, Quan Martin. You still got Jeremy Reeves on the roster. Right? I think they all just kind of threaten Percy Butler's status with the team. So this one isn't really necessarily about Percy not doing something or not being the right type of player. I think he's got the requisite heart to play on this defense. I don't know that he really measures up to play on this defense, but I think that with all these additions that the Commanders are bringing in, he might just be the odd man out when all things are said and done. So those are some players that Washington could go shopping for. Who could be shopping themselves to potentially move? And yes, all 3 of them, Ron Rivera era players. I don't think that's really necessarily a coincidence, but who are some players that the Washington Commanders could be looking to buy? Number one name that we're going to talk about here, running back J.K. Dobbins. The reason J.K. Dobbins comes up on here is because, again, a lot of us were really focused on the running back position alongside the edge position as a position that the Commanders might address in the NFL draft early. They didn't do that. ESPN recently did a best fit for remaining free agents, and Dobbins' match was the Washington Commanders. So ESPN said, quote, finding an ideal fit for a veteran running back isn't easy at this point in the offseason, especially for a player with Dobbins' rich injury history. He missed 4 games with an MCL sprain last season, yet he still managed a career high in rushing yards, 905, and tied a career high in rushing touchdowns, 9. In Cliff Kingsbury's offense in Washington, I can see Dobbins providing competition for Brian Robinson Jr. as the early down runner. Dobbins can run between the tackles and has the juice to create big plays on the ground. He took 27 carries for 10 or more yards last season, end quote. Now, this isn't an apples to apples comparison, right? I don't want to necessarily say Dobbins, Robinson, 1 for 1, because again, the Chargers offense, the Chargers line is different. The Commanders offense, Commanders line is different. So you can't just transpose one's production over the other. However, Dobbins did play 1 fewer game than Brian Robinson, ran the ball 8 more times despite that fact, gained 106 more yards on the ground than B-Rob did. He also averaged 0.3 yards more per carry, had 1 more rushing touchdown while bringing in 12 more receptions, but Dobbins did have fewer receiving yards despite the fact he had a dozen more catches. So some of that can be explained again by the offense. The Chargers were a much more ground-focused team than Washington, but it is likely Dobbins is it likely that Dobbins is better than B-Rob with the Commanders? Honestly, I'd say they're probably a push right now. The benefit of making a move like this, if you sign Dobbins and you trade Robinson, and I'm right, and this is a push, and you basically have the same overall running back room, but you get to trade a player and potentially get some more assets. Like maybe you want to trade Brian Robinson to a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have certainly been trying to shop around, adding some more weapons to their offense. They've got rookie running back Caleb Johnson. They've got veteran Jalen Warren, but could certainly use a guy like Brian Robinson who has experience, is known for his toughness. And if you package him with, like, let's say a 2026 third rounder, maybe you can get the Steelers 2026 second rounder. You lose your third rounder, but you get back up earlier in the NFL draft in the top 50. Could work out for both teams. Who knows? Again, just an idea. Or another trade package you could potentially consider is sending Daron Payne to, say, the Jacksonville Jaguars for a package that gets you their second round pick, which could then set the Commanders up to buy a player who isn't currently a free agent, but could come available, according to current rumors and other aspirations from other teams. Our second and third buys in this episode are both coming from the same team. They're both coming via trade from a team that nearly mounted a comeback against Washington just last season, the New Orleans Saints. That coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Are the New Orleans Saints interested in selling some of the key players on their team? Look, for more on the New Orleans Saints, head over to Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson has all that information for you. But when you look at the state of the Saints, especially as how they stack up in the NFC South, not considered the most difficult division in football, yet the Saints are one of the worst teams in that division, perhaps poised to be the worst team in that division. given the retirement of Derek Carr. They do have Tyler Shuck there as their quarterback, leading the room, but we'll see how that works out. So New Orleans Saints are a team that a lot of people are talking about as being potential sellers here in this phase of the roster building process. And they do have some really good players to potentially sell off if they decided to do so. Now, the Saints did recently rebuff the Pittsburgh Steelers' attempts to trade for receiver Chris Olave, but many feel that the team should still be considering selling and might change their mind on whether or not they're willing to move some players later on here in the offseason, maybe even a little bit into training camp. Sometimes we see that. So I asked Ross, if the Saints ever come off their stance and say we're now willing to listen to offers for a guy like Chris Olave, what would it take? And he said it would take a second-round pick, because that is apparently what they were telling the Steelers it would take if they were open to trading Chris Olave in general. Not a package adding up to a second-round pick. It's very important to specify this. Not second-round pick value. It's a legit second-round pick. Now, the Commanders don't have a second-round pick in 2026 currently. So if they were wanting to be interested in a guy like Chris Olave, how perhaps New Orleans would be enticed by a trade that, say, sends the Commanders first-round pick next year to the Saints in exchange for Olave and, I don't know, their third or fourth-round picks, or the Commanders send a first and a fifth to New Orleans for Olave and a second. Like, there's, again, I don't want to get too locked into the specifics of the trade here, but if you're looking for that second-round pick or better, you get that first, you send a package back. It basically all balances out as far as the trade value goes. Or, like we mentioned in the last segment, you send, I don't think you're getting a second-round pick for Brian Robinson straight up. You're not getting a second-round pick for Daron Payne straight up. But, again, a package involving either of these two players, and you get that second-round pick. You then send that second-round pick to the New Orleans Saints. It'd be a lot more pick shuffling, a lot more pick spending. But, again, Adam Peters kind of showed this offseason that if it's the right player, he's willing to do it. Is Chris Olave that right player? That would be a question internally to be asked by the Washington Commanders. But as we look at him, Olave turns 25 in June. He was a first-round pick in 2022 after a draft day trade with the Washington Commanders, who traded out of the 11th spot where the Saints drafted Chris Olave. The Commanders, took Jahan Dotson. Olave played in 15 and 16 games in his first two seasons, respectively, both 1,000-yard receiving seasons. He did suffer a concussion in midway through the 2024 season that cost him the rest of that year. So, again, a down year in production for Olave because of that. And the Saints did pick up his fifth-year option, which means that is fully guaranteed $15.5 million in 2026, and he'd eat up about $2 million of the Commander's salary cap in 2025. So, very affordable player overall for this year. And then, again, you got the $15.5 million fifth-year option next year. But the Saints have another player they might be willing to part with if they do start selling. That is running back Alvin Kamara. So, again, we're back in the running back conversation. Turns 30 in July, has never rushed for 1,000 yards in a single season. However, he's had 1,000 yards from scrimmage of offense in all 8 of his NFL seasons. 5-time Pro Bowler, would add around $3 million in salary cap, and has 2025 and 2026 left under contract. So this is a guy that you would be able to trade for and get a couple of years out of. You're not going to have to send a second-round pick to the Saints for him, things like that. So for those looking at the running back position still, perhaps Alvin Kamara comes in and adds a little bit of dynamic to the room. Again, I think the running back room is very, very full right now, but I know that there are still people who are very interested in hoping that the Commanders are going to do something to kind of shake up that group just a little bit. There's still some other options out there for running backs as well. Travis Etienne Jr. is a player that perhaps could be available. According to ESPN's Jeremy Fowler, he reported earlier this offseason the Jags are not necessarily in love with Etienne, though, haven't heard a whole lot of smoke other than that. But if that's the case, that he could potentially be moved. Nick Chubb is a free agent that I know a lot of insiders have interest in. The Browns basically said they're not bringing him back, barring injury to one of their top backs. So, the fact that the Browns don't want him back, kind of telling a little bit. But, I know there's still a lot of love for him out there. And, of course, for one episode, we don't talk about the edge group. And I know some people are out there going to say, what about the edge group? Of course, the Saints also have some edge rushers. They've got Granderson, they've got Cam Jordan, stuff like that. But I did want to focus in a little bit outside the edge group just because we have talked so much about the edge group this offseason. And, of course, we're all still monitoring the Trey Hendrickson news as it comes out and as that drama continues to unfold in Cincinnati. Zadarius Smith continues to be a good target out there. Von Miller continues to be a good target out there, but we talked pretty extensively about them. So if you missed any of those edge group conversations, by all means, head back in the timeline. You can certainly find those living on forever on YouTube or on your audio streams as you see fit as well. In the next episode of Locked On Commanders, we're going to be doing our mailbag for this week. Insiders are going to be asking their questions. Perhaps they want to hear more about the edge group, and we'll talk about that there. Perhaps they want to hear more about some of these running backs that are available, and we'll be talking about that. You never know, but you always know that Commanders insiders are going to bring the heat when it comes to these mailbag episodes. If you want to get involved, head to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Become an insider today. And not only can you send me your questions for mailbag episodes, you're going to get information and insight from me directly that goes beyond the show. You're also going to participate in other show shaping efforts, like a current poll that I have out that asks the Washington Commanders, or Locked On Commanders insiders, I should say, for the top 10 most important Commanders currently on the roster for the future of the franchise. That vote going on right now as we speak. Very interesting results coming in there. Only 2 players have been put on every single ballot so far, and you can probably guess at least who one of them is, if not both of them. For your next listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast. Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino are going to help you stay the most informed NFL fans this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day, every dayers. Thanks for coming through every single day. For everybody out there, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you right back here next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.